A woman named Fountain Hughes died in a Baltimore hospital at the age of 101. Fountain had been born into slavery in Virginia in 1848 and had lived as enslaved property for the first 17 years of her life before the Civil War ended that status in 1865. She had lived through 88 years of freedom, had witnessed the entire arc of Reconstruction, Jim Crow, both world wars, and the early beginnings of the civil rights movement. What Fountain wanted to talk about was not the long decades of freedom, but the short years of slavery. What Fountain told her family in those final conversations, and what she had told an interviewer who recorded her voice in 1949 in one of the last audio recordings ever made of a formerly enslaved person, revealed aspects of slavery that contradicted comfortable narratives and that forced confrontation with realities that America had spent nearly a century trying to forget. Before we hear what Fountain Hughes remembered about the old world of slavery and what she wanted future generations to know before that living memory died forever, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epoch of Fear, where we preserve the voices that history tried to silence. Virginia in 1848, the property of a man whose name she would later struggle to recall, not because her mother's name was Anne, and Fountain had siblings, though the exact number and their fates were unclear, because enslaved families were constantly disrupted by sales and separations. She remembered being hungry constantly, not starving, but never having enough food to feel satisfied, living with the background sensation of want that was deliberate policy, because slaveholders believed that keeping enslaved people slightly underfed made them more compliant and more focused on work. She remembered fear, the constant awareness that white people had absolute power over her life, and that any mistake or perceived disrespect could result in violence. And she remembered work, being put to tasks as soon as she was physically capable, starting with small jobs like carrying water or watching younger children, and graduating to fieldwork as she grew older and stronger. The specific plantation where Fountain was enslaved was a mid-sized operation, growing tobacco and mixed crops, worked by approximately 40 enslaved people whose labor generated wealth for the owner, while they themselves remained in poverty and subjection. Fountain's memories of the plantation's physical layout and daily operations were remarkably detailed even 7 decades after she left it, suggesting that the experience had been seared into her memory with an intensity that time could not erase. She remembered the big house where the white family lived, a structure that seemed enormous and impossibly elegant to a child who lived in a one-room cabin with a dirt floor. She remembered the tobacco barns where the crop was dried and processed, buildings where enslaved people worked long hours in conditions that were hot and airless, and that left them coughing the dust. She remembered the overseer's house, positioned where the overseer could monitor the slave quarters and could respond quickly to any sign of resistance or escape. She remembered the whipping post where punishments were administered publicly to terrorize the entire enslaved community into compliance. And she remembered the slave quarters themselves, the rows of small cabins where families lived in conditions that Fountain would later describe as worse than any animal shelter, structures that were deliberately kept minimal because slaveholders did not want to invest resources in housing for people they considered temporary and replaceable property. Fountain's description of daily life under slavery, recorded in her 1949 interview and elaborated in conversations with family, contradicted several myths that had developed in American culture about slavery in the decades since its abolition. The Gone with the Wind mythology portrayed slavery as a paternalistic system where benevolent masters cared for childlike slaves who were generally content with their position, where violence was rare and was reserved for exceptional circumstances, and where family bonds between masters and slaves created genuine affection that mitigated the harshness of the system. Fountain's memories described something completely different. The master she remembered was not benevolent, but was indifferent at best and cruel when his financial interests or his authority were challenged. The overseers and drivers who managed day-to-day operations were not kind father figures, but were men who used violence constantly and casually, who whipped people for failing to meet work quotas or for showing insufficient deference, and who created an atmosphere of terror that made enslaved people focus all their energy on avoiding punishment, rather than on any kind of personal development or family life. The enslaved people Fountain remembered were not content, but were desperate, angry, and constantly strategizing about how to survive and how to carve out small spaces of autonomy within a system designed to deny them any control over their lives. And the relationships between white and black people at the plantation were not characterized by affection, but by fear, resentment, and the constant awareness that white people could destroy black people's lives on a whim without facing any consequences. One of Fountain's most powerful memories concerned a woman she knew who was sold away from her children when the plantation owner needed cash to pay debts. Fountain was approximately 10 years old when this happened, old enough to understand what was occurring, but young enough to be traumatized by witnessing it. The woman, whose name Fountain remembered as Lucy, was a field worker who had 3 children ranging from infancy to about 6 years old. When the slave trader came to the plantation to purchase Lucy, she begged the owner to either keep her or to sell her children with her so the family would not be separated. The owner refused both requests because the trader was only buying Lucy, and because the children were too young to be valuable in a sale, and were more profitable kept at the plantation where they would eventually grow old enough to work. Lucy was loaded into a wagon in chains, while her children screamed and tried to run to her. And Fountain remembered the enslaved community being forced to watch as a lesson about the consequences of debt and about the absolute power that masters wielded over families. Fountain never learned what happened to Lucy after she was taken away, and she never forgot the sound of Lucy's children crying for days after their mother was sold. This memory shaped Fountain's understanding of slavery more than any other single incident, demonstrating that the system was designed to destroy families and that no enslaved person was safe, no matter how hard they worked or how compliant they appeared. Fountain's memories of slavery's end in 1865 were vivid and complex, mixing joy at freedom with confusion about what freedom actually meant and how to survive in a world where the structures that had controlled her entire life suddenly no longer existed. She was 17 years old when the Civil War ended, old enough to have formed clear memories of the transition from slavery to freedom, but young enough that most of her life and all of her identity formation had occurred under slavery. She remembered Union soldiers arriving at the plantation and gathering the enslaved people to inform them that they were free, that they could leave if they wanted, and that they could not be forced to work without wages. She remembered the mixed reactions from the enslaved community, with some people celebrating immediately and others uncertain about what freedom meant practically, or whether it would last. She remembered the white family's anger and bitterness, their sense of being victimized by the war and by the loss of property they believed they had legitimately owned. And she remembered her own confusion about where to go and what to do, because 17 years of slavery had not prepared her with skills or resources or connections that would allow her to easily navigate freedom. She had no money, limited education, because teaching enslaved people to read was illegal, no family connections outside the plantation, because sales had scattered her relatives, and no experience making decisions about her own life, because every decision had always been made by the people who owned her. The immediate post-emancipation period that Fountain remembered was characterized by chaos, hope, and the rapid disillusionment that came when formerly enslaved people discovered that legal freedom did not automatically translate into practical freedom or into the resources necessary to build independent lives. Fountain worked on the same plantation for several months after emancipation, now theoretically as a paid worker, but in practice receiving minimal wages and facing threats and violence from the former master and overseers who resented the loss of their slave property and who tried to maintain as much control as possible through economic coercion and intimidation. She remembered the Freedmen's Bureau representatives who came to the area trying to help formerly enslaved people negotiate contracts and protect their rights. But she also remembered that these representatives were overwhelmed by the scale of need and that they often could not enforce the protections they promised because local white authorities refused to cooperate. She remembered the violence that erupted in the region as white supremacists organized to prevent black people from exercising their new rights. Violence that included beatings, murders, and economic retaliation against anyone who tried to challenge the racial hierarchy. And she remembered the gradual realization that while slavery had legally ended, many of its essential features were being reconstructed through new mechanisms like sharecropping, debt peonage, and the black codes that restricted black people's movement and opportunities in ways that closely resembled slavery, even if the legal terminology was different. Fountain left Virginia in the late 1860s, moving first to Washington, D.C., and then eventually to Baltimore, where she would live for the rest of her life. The migration was motivated partly by economic opportunity in cities that were growing rapidly in the post-war period, and partly by the desire to escape the plantation where she had been enslaved and where too many traumatic memories were embedded in the landscape. In Baltimore, Fountain worked various jobs throughout her long life, primarily as a domestic worker, cleaning houses and caring for white families' children, work that was poorly paid, but that was one of the few options available to black women with limited formal education. She married at some point in the 1870s or 1880s, though her husband's name and the details of their relationship were not well documented, and he apparently died relatively young, leaving Fountain to support herself for many decades as a widow. She had children, though the exact number is uncertain from available records, and at least some of them predeceased her. By the time she reached old age in the 1940s and 1950s, Fountain was living with extended family members who cared for her and who listened to her stories about the old days. Stories that younger generations found both fascinating and disturbing because they revealed a history that was still living in Fountain's memory, but that felt impossibly distant to people who had grown up in the 20th century. The 1949 interview that captured Fountain's voice and memories was conducted by the Library of Congress as part of a project to record the last surviving formerly enslaved people before they all died, and their direct memories of slavery died with them. By 1949, very few such people remained alive, and those who did were all in their 90s or older, their numbers dwindling rapidly as mortality claimed the final generation who had experienced slavery firsthand. The interviewer who recorded Fountain understood the historical significance of what he was documenting and tried to ask questions that would elicit detailed memories about slavery's realities. Fountain's responses, captured on primitive recording equipment that produced audio of poor quality, but that preserved her actual voice for posterity, were remarkable for their clarity, their detail, and their emotional honesty about an experience that she had spent much of her life trying to move beyond. At 101 years old, Fountain's memory of slavery was sharper than her memory of events from the previous year, demonstrating how profoundly those early experiences had shaped her consciousness, despite more than 8 decades of freedom that followed. In the recording, Fountain's voice was thin and wavering with age, but still strong enough to carry emotion as she described what slavery had been like. She spoke about the hunger and the cold, and the fear with a directness that made clear these were not historical abstractions, but were experiences she could still feel when she remembered them. She spoke about the work, the endless labor from dawn until dark, in fields where the heat or the cold made every movement painful, but where stopping work meant punishment. She spoke about the violence, casual and constant, used to control behavior and to remind enslaved people of their powerlessness. She spoke about family separations, about people she loved being sold away and never seen again, about children crying for parents and parents crying for children with no power to prevent the separations. And she spoke about the psychological weight of being property, of living every day with the knowledge that someone else owned you and could do whatever they wanted with you, and that there was no appeal to law or morality because the law supported slavery and the prevailing morality claimed it was natural and right. These descriptions, delivered in Fountain's own words and preserved in her own voice, provided testimony about slavery that no historian's interpretation could match because they came directly from someone who had lived it. Was not her descriptions of slavery's specific horrors, but her insistence on the psychological damage that extended far beyond legal emancipation. She said that, of course, freedom was better than slavery. She said that white people who had never experienced slavery, or who were generations removed from enslaving people, often asked her to forgive or to forget, but that they did not understand that some experiences could not be forgiven, and that forgetting would be a betrayal of everyone who had suffered and died under slavery. And she said that the most important thing she could tell anyone listening to her recording was that slavery had been worse than anything they could imagine, and that its effects had not ended with legal emancipation, but continued to shape American society in ways that white America refused to acknowledge. Fountain's final years, from the late 1940s until her death in 1953, were marked by increasing physical frailty, but also by a determination to share her memories with her family and with anyone who would listen before those memories died with her. She knew that she was among the last of a generation, that very few people who had been enslaved were still alive, and that soon there would be no one left who could describe slavery from personal experience. This knowledge made her feel a responsibility to speak, to document, to ensure that the truth about what she had experienced would be preserved. Her family members who cared for her in those final years later described how Fountain would tell stories about slavery in surprising detail, how she would become animated when describing specific incidents or people she remembered, and how she would insist that the younger generations understand that slavery was not the gone-with-the-wind fantasy of benevolent masters and happy slaves, but was systematic violence and dehumanization that had destroyed millions of lives. These family conversations, while not formally recorded, like the 1949 interview, were preserved in the memories of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who listened to Fountain and who later wrote down what they remembered of her stories, creating a body of family oral history that supplemented the official recorded interview. In Fountain's final days in spring 1953, when she was hospitalized and when it was clear that she would not recover, family members gathered to hear what she wanted to say before she died. These deathbed conversations, recounted by family members decades later, covered multiple topics, but kept returning to themes that Fountain felt were essential to communicate. She wanted her descendants to understand how brutal slavery had been, so they would recognize how much progress had been made in the 88 years since emancipation, but also so they would not take that progress for granted or assume that it was permanent. She wanted them to understand that the racism and discrimination they experienced in 1953 America was connected to slavery, that it was not something separate, but was a continuation of the same fundamental denial of black humanity that had justified slavery, and that fighting current racism required understanding its roots in that earlier system. She wanted them to value education because she had been denied it, to use their rights because she had not had any, and to never submit to injustice because submission was what slavery had demanded and what she had been forced to give during her childhood. And she wanted them to remember her not as a pathetic old woman who had been victimized by history, but as someone who had survived and who had lived a long life despite everything that had been done to prevent that survival. One specific memory that Fountain shared in her final days, a memory that her family later identified as being particularly important to her, concerned a moment during her enslaved childhood when she had dared to ask her mother why they were slaves and why they could not be free. Fountain was probably 7 or 8 years old when she asked this question, old enough to recognize that her situation was unjust, but not old enough to understand the full scope of the system that imprisoned her. Her mother's response, as Fountain remembered it over 90 years later, was to explain that slavery was not natural or right, but was something that white people had created and imposed through violence, that it was wrong and that someday it would end, and that until it ended, the most important thing was to survive and to maintain dignity, even in conditions designed to destroy it. Fountain said that this conversation with her mother, brief as it was and dangerous to have, because enslaved people discussing freedom could be punished severely, had shaped everything that came after. It had given her hope that slavery would not be permanent, had taught her that maintaining her sense of self was a form of resistance, even when open resistance was impossible, and had demonstrated that enslaved people understood their oppression and rejected it, even when they could not escape it. This memory of her mother's words, preserved across nearly a century, was one of the things that Fountain wanted most to pass down to her descendants, because it demonstrated that enslaved people had been conscious, thinking, resisting people rather than the passive victims that mythology often portrayed. Fountain died on May 19, 1953, at Baltimore's Providence Hospital, surrounded by family members who had listened to her stories and who knew that they were witnessing the end of an era. Her death was noted in local newspapers with brief obituaries that mentioned her advanced age and her status as one of the last people born into slavery, but the national press did not cover her death because by 1953, the connection to slavery felt ancient and irrelevant to a country focused on the present and future, rather than on a past that many white Americans wanted to forget. But for the black community in Baltimore and beyond, Fountain's death was significant precisely because it marked the loss of living memory, the moment when slavery shifted from something that real people could describe from experience to something that existed only in books and recordings and in second-hand accounts filtered through time. The 1949 recording of Fountain's voice would become increasingly valuable over subsequent decades, as historians and the public recognized that such recordings were irreplaceable primary sources that provided testimony about slavery that written documents could never fully capture. And the stories that Fountain had told her family in her final years would be passed down through generations, preserved in family memory, and eventually documented in written accounts and interviews that added to the historical record of how enslaved people experienced and understood their oppression. The question of why Fountain's testimony, and the testimony of other formerly enslaved people was not taken more seriously during their lifetimes, reveals uncomfortable truths about how American society chose to remember and forget slavery in the decades after its abolition. Between emancipation in 1865 and the mid-20th century, when the last formerly enslaved people died, there was a concerted effort by white society to construct a historical narrative about slavery that minimized its horrors and that portrayed it as a tragic but benign institution that had been ended through white enlightenment rather than through black resistance and white violence. This narrative required ignoring or dismissing the testimony of people like Fountain, who could describe slavery's actual brutality from personal experience. When formerly enslaved people described systematic violence, family destruction, and deliberate dehumanization, white historians and popular culture often responded by claiming these were exaggerations or atypical experiences, by suggesting that the speakers were embittered or unreliable, or by simply ignoring testimony that contradicted preferred narratives. The result was that millions of Americans grew up learning about slavery through Gone with the Wind and other romanticized portrayals, rather than through the testimony of people who had actually experienced it. And this historical miseducation shaped racial attitudes and policies throughout the 20th century. The recovery of formerly enslaved people's testimony as serious historical evidence began in earnest in the 1960s and 1970s as the Civil Rights Movement forced broader reconsideration of American racial history, and as historians began systematically studying sources that had been previously dismissed or ignored. The interviews conducted with formerly enslaved people in the 1930s through the Federal Writers Project, and in the 1940s and early 1950s by organizations like the Library of Congress, were rediscovered and began to be analyzed seriously as primary historical sources rather than as curiosities or as unreliable memories of events from long ago. Fountain's 1949 recording was among the materials that historians examined, and her testimony, along with that of other formerly enslaved people, began to reshape understanding of what slavery had actually been like as distinct from how it had been portrayed in popular mythology. This scholarship demonstrated that enslaved people's memories were remarkably consistent in describing systematic brutality, family destruction, sexual exploitation, and psychological damage, and that these consistencies across hundreds of interviews suggested not individual bitterness, but accurate description of what slavery had involved. The effect was to validate what people like Fountain had been saying for decades, but what white society had refused to hear: that slavery had been a crime against humanity that had destroyed millions of lives, and that its effects extended far beyond legal emancipation. The legacy of Fountain Hughes and of the other formerly enslaved people who lived into the 20th century and who shared their memories extends beyond their specific testimony to influence how we think about historical memory and about the relationship between lived experience and historical truth. Fountain's memories of slavery were not abstractions or interpretations, but were descriptions of things she had actually experienced, and the emotional weight she carried 90 years after emancipation demonstrated that some experiences create wounds that time cannot fully heal. Her insistence on telling her story, despite the discomfort it created for white listeners who preferred more comfortable narratives about slavery, demonstrated that historical truth matters more than present convenience, and that the obligation to remember extends across generations. And her determination to pass down her memories to her descendants before she died demonstrated understanding that historical memory is fragile and must be actively maintained, or it will be lost and replaced by myths that serve powerful interests rather than truth. These lessons remain relevant today as debates continue about how to teach and remember difficult aspects of American history, and about whose voices and experiences should be centered in those discussions. The specific details that Fountain shared about slavery have been invaluable to historians trying to historical documents more easily reveal. Her memories of family separations, of children being sold away from parents, and of parents being sold away from children, documented the human cost of practices that account books reduced to financial transactions. Her testimony about the psychological damage of being treated as property rather than as a person helped historians understand the long-term effects of slavery that extended beyond physical abuse to include profound trauma that shaped how formerly enslaved people saw themselves and the world. The question of what responsibility contemporary Americans have to remember and reckon with slavery, as described by people like Fountain Hughes, rather than as portrayed in sanitized versions, has become increasingly central to debates about historical memory and racial justice. Fountain's testimony, and that of other formerly enslaved people, make it impossible to maintain comfortable myths about slavery being anything other than systematic violence and dehumanization that destroyed millions of lives over centuries. This testimony demands acknowledgement of slavery as a foundational American crime, rather than as a regrettable but minor aspect of history that can be quickly mentioned and then forgotten. It demands recognition that the wealth accumulated through slavery benefited white families for generations, while the descendants of enslaved people were systematically denied opportunities to accumulate similar wealth through deliberate policies that extended long after slavery's legal end. And it demands honest teaching of slavery in schools, and honest discussion of its legacy, rather than the evasions and minimizations that have characterized much American historical education. These demands are uncomfortable for many Americans, particularly white Americans, whose ancestors either enslaved people or benefited from the systems built on slavery. But Fountain's testimony makes clear that such discomfort is minor compared to the actual suffering that slavery inflicted, and that honest reckoning requires accepting discomfort rather than avoiding it. What would Fountain Hughes want Americans in the 21st century to understand about slavery, based on her memories and her final conversations with family? She would want us to understand that slavery was worse than we imagine, that even our most vivid conceptions of its brutality probably fall short of the reality that she and millions of others experienced. She would want us to understand that enslaved people were fully human, that they thought and felt and loved and hoped just as free people do, and that being treated as property was a profound violation of their humanity that caused damage that extended across generations. She would want us to understand that slavery did not end cleanly with emancipation, but rather transformed into new systems of racial control that preserved many of slavery's essential features, even if the legal terminology changed. She would want us to value and protect the freedom and rights that she never had during her childhood, and that she only partially had during most of her adult life. And she would want us to listen to the testimony of people who experienced depression rather than dismissing or minimizing their accounts, because those accounts are uncomfortable or challenge preferred narratives. These lessons, preserved in Fountain's 1949 recording and in the family memories of her final conversations, remain relevant and necessary for understanding both history and present. Remember Fountain Hughes. Remember that she was born into slavery in 1848 and lived until 1953, bridging two completely different Americas, separated by the Civil War and emancipation, but connected by ongoing struggles over race and power. Remember that she carried memories of slavery for over 80 years after it ended, that those memories shaped everything about how she understood the world, and that she spent her final years trying to ensure that future generations would know the truth about what she had experienced. Remember that she was one of the last voices who could describe slavery from personal experience rather than from books, and that her death in 1953 marked the loss of living memory and the transition of slavery from present to past. Remember that what she described contradicted comfortable myths about benevolent masters and contented slaves, that she testified to systematic brutality and dehumanization that millions experienced, and that her testimony was dismissed or ignored for decades because it was too uncomfortable for white society to accept. And remember that the truth she told matters more than the myths she challenged, that historical honesty requires listening to people who experienced oppression, even when their testimony disturbs us, and that Fountain's voice, preserved in a scratchy 1949 recording, speaks truths about American history that we cannot afford to forget. What do you think about Fountain Hughes's testimony and her determination to share her memories before she died? Does her description of slavery change how you understand that period of American history? What responsibility do we have to listen to and learn from the testimony of people who experienced oppression rather than relying on more comfortable second-hand accounts? And how should Fountain's insistence that slavery's effects extended far beyond legal? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If Fountain's story challenged your understanding of slavery and demonstrated the importance of preserving and honoring the testimony of people who experienced historical injustice, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We are committed to recovering and amplifying voices that were suppressed or dismissed, to ensuring that historical truth is told even when it is uncomfortable, and to honoring people like Fountain Hughes, who carried impossible memories, and who insisted on sharing them despite knowing that doing so meant reliving trauma. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that slavery was not the myth of Gone with the Wind, but was the reality that Fountain described, and that her voice speaking truth across more than a century deserves to be heard and remembered. Fountain Hughes died in 1953, the last generation who remembered the old world firsthand. Because she was there, and she told us what it was like, and we have an obligation not to forget.